and welcome to the Keyboard Chronicles, a podcast for keyboard players. I'm your host, David Holloway, and I'm thrilled as always to be here with you. This episode, I'm super excited to bring you Mr. Mike Mangan. So as you'll hear, Mike has had, like a lot of our guests, one hell of a career playing with a swathe of artists. We cover a lot of his career in this interview, from working with, again, the iconic Glenn Hughes, through to his work with the Cult since 2022. We also talk about everyone from Robby, Krieger, through to Melvin Seals, and lots more. I'm going to leave a couple of them as a surprise to you, just some of the amazing ones. Actually, I won't give it as too much of a surprise. There's one of the most amazing Keith Emerson anecdotes involving Mike direct that you'll hear. Just an amazing train wreck story, well worth the wait for. Hope you enjoy this, and I'll talk to you at the end of the show. Mike, an absolute pleasure to have you on the show, sir. And I think you're in the top 10 of the best backgrounds while we chat.
Well, thank you, David. Pleasure as well. This is my number one right here, Burgundy Betty. So
Burgundy Betty, I love it. I'm sure
my old upright piano. There's a story behind that for sure. So
yeah, no, I'm sure we'll be talking about both. So no, that's great. Great to have you here. I thought we'd kick off. I know your upbringing and musical upbringing is quite interesting. So just tell us about the early years of Mike Mangan and how you got into music in the first place.
Well, I grew up in Waukesha, Wisconsin, southeastern Wisconsin. And I went to Catholic school, and my first piano lessons that my mother put me in were at my Catholic school from a nun named Sister Sedella. And there was a church there, too, with a pipe organ, and she was the pipe organist as well. So I had early exposure to organs and piano, so that was definitely the beginning of the whole shebang. I think I was 6 years old. I do remember my first piano recital back then. I forgot the song halfway through, and I started crying because I was so embarrassed. And somebody in the crowd just started clapping. And then I ran off the stage back to my mother. So that was my first live performance.
I think we could argue that's the earliest train wreck we've heard, but I'm sure we'll talk about others later.
That's the earliest. That's the early train wreck. I didn't even think of that. Yeah, that could be the train wreck.
So that was your, so you had a nun teach you. So I'm fascinated, given your ongoing career, particularly with your focus on the organ. What stood out to you, if you can remember back that far, around the pipe organ? Obviously, a very different beast to what you're playing now, but just what attracted you to that versus the piano?
Well, like you said, maybe there was some subconscious infusion from being around a pipe organ. But when I think about the Hammond organ, I really think it goes back to my first exposure to probably the Allman Brothers and Santana, if I'm remembering. I always liked Greg Allman's organ padding and his solos. One of my albums is an Allman Brothers album. And then Greg Raleigh's work in Santana, his solos in Oye Como Va, I just thought it was the craziest sounding instrument. And I just thought it sounded so cool what those guys did with it. And I think that was my initial attraction, inspiration. And I remember I wanted to not play knockoffs. I wanted to play the real vintage one that those guys used to make those recordings and get that tone. I think that was the initial spark.
And do you recall, when did you lay your hands on a real Hammond for the first time? It might help us sort of work into where you're playing in bands and stuff. When was that?
Yeah, well, it's actually kind of interesting. One of my brothers is a musician, and my mother, they tried to help me find a real Hammond organ. So I grew up outside of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and there's actually a very well-known organist, Hammond organist named Bob Kames. He's passed since, but he, in America anyways, there's a famous song called The Chicken Dance that they play at baseball games. Everybody knows it, maybe you know it. Bob wrote that song, actually. He was kind of like a Polish-American polka kind of musician. And it was a hit, and he did pretty well off of it. And he ended up opening up a music store in Milwaukee, and they sold mostly Hammond organs. I mean, it's kind of hard to find a Hammond organ store, a vintage Hammond organ store, but he had this. His son runs it now. So we went down there, and that's where I bought my Hammond B3, which what Burgundy Betty actually still is. But it went through a transformation a few years ago. But that's where I got my original B3 from my hometown.
And so two things. I never thought the chicken dance would come up in context of this podcast, so that's amazing because it was indeed, I assume it was a worldwide charting hit. It was certainly huge in Australia in the mid to late 80s.
Was it really?
Oh, yeah, it was huge.
That is great.
You couldn't get away from it. So I find that great. But I'm just interested, going back to Burgundy Betty, and the first time you sat down at a Hammond and actually played it, do you recall what that was like?
It was confusing at first. Just trying to get a handle on the functionality and how the drawbars work and the preset, the black keys and the white keys, what they do. I had a lot of questions to just figure out how to work the beast, the functionality. So I do remember that. But I also bought my 122 Leslie from Bob Kane, so I got the whole package there. But I also just remember how much I loved the tone in person in front of me. I just thought it was amazing. It was inspiring, and absolutely loved it. And I got a set of dollies from him to move it too.
Yeah, so. That's always helpful. Do you recall? And I don't understand if you don't, Mike. Do you recall what it cost to buy back then?
Actually, it was kind of beat up, and I think the B3 was about $1,200 to $1,500. My B3. Mm-hmm. And the Leslie was about $1,000.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, the cabinet was beat up. I actually ended up, it was black at first when I first bought it. And then I took it to so many gigs when I got out to Los Angeles, and I wasn't really moving it carefully, and the legs started to crack. So I took it to my friend in Organ Tech, Ken Rich here, who I've known for a long time. Helped me out a lot in my career, Ken. And he recabineted it into a different cabinet, a brown one. And this is the third incarnation of it now. Wow.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think Ken's name's popped up a few times. I know he's an iconic guy as far as restoration and stuff. But so before we move you out to Los Angeles, let's still stay in Milwaukee for a while. So what were your first bands? And so you've got a Hammond, and either before or after that, were you starting to play in groups?
I was, I was doing little recordings by myself, and I did have a couple groups, but it's really not too long after that I moved to LA. So I didn't spend a whole lot of time playing in the local scene out there after I bought my rig.
Yeah. And so the obvious question then is, what was the culture shock like of moving to LA and finding your way in music in that much bigger pond?
I thought I had a couple options. I could go to New York, I could go to Nashville, I could go to LA, and just for the things that I was interested in musically and for the weather. I mean, Wisconsin's very, very cold. Brutal winters. There's, all those things put together kind of attracted me to Los Angeles. And I don't know, I wasn't too worried about it. I mean, I figured it's going to be an adventure, and I kind of just jumped in and went for it, And I moved out with a friend of mine. Just an interesting side note. Have you ever seen the show Leave It To Beaver?
Yes, yeah. A little bit before my time, but I've seen the odd snippet, yeah.
Yeah, it's but it's a classic American show. So the guy that played Beaver ended up being friends with my friend's father, and he owned a house up in Newhall, and that's actually where I lived for a few years when I first got out here. The Beaver was my landlord.
What?
So.
Yeah, that is cool.
Good guy. Jerry Mathers, that's his name.
That's amazing. And so you're finding your way in LA. What are your recollections of those early sort of band stuff. What was the first thing you got into where you thought, okay, I'm making a real go of this?
Well, as soon as I got out here, there was a music magazine in circulation then. I mean, I don't think they have hard copies anymore. It might be online. It was called Music Connection. And they had classified ads, for musicians and bands looking for to hire people or bring people in the band. And I just went to that right away. And I remember going on a couple auditions and working with a few people right off the bat. But, I like to write songs. I like to be involved in songwriting also. And I kind of wanted to get in a band to write songs with people and be in a band rather than be, a hired gun to play somebody else's music in a project. So the first band I actually got in was called The Kinship. It was more like a Southern rock, kind of maybe Black Crowes influenced type of band. I'm still friends with several of those guys to this day. I was in that band for several years. We put out a full-length album. I think it was about 14 tracks. And that was my first band out here where I was really involved in the songwriting. There was a lot of Hammond organ. There was piano in it. And, that was the first go at it right there.
Yeah, so that would have been a formative experience. And is that when you realised you did have some songwriting chops? And when did you make the decision, I'm going to do this full time? Had that happened before the move to LA, or you were still thinking,
yeah,
okay,
that was my intention from the beginning. The reason I came out here. But I've worked plenty of jobs, in the meantime to get by and so forth. But that definitely was my intention from the very beginning. That band, unfortunately, as with so many bands, people had some personal issues. The lead singer in that particular band, he ended up having to move back to Texas. He was from Texas. And so eventually it just, people had to go their separate ways after several years, unfortunately. But, that was a good learning experience as well, to realize what it takes to try to keep a band together, because it's, as we all know, it's not easy.
And probably aligned with that, Mike, when did you first start doing your own band? So I definitely do want to talk about your big organ trio. So I'm guessing this is still a little bit early in the career for that, but just weave that in when did you start getting an interest of, okay, I don't want to be just a side man. I want to write some songs in a band context. When did you really start working up your own outfit?
Yeah, well, that's definitely prior to Big Organ Trio. After The Kinship, I did another full-length album in a band called The Void. It was just me and the singer. We wrote everything, and the keys were more of the lead instrument in that situation. We brought a guitar player in to mostly play rhythm guitar. That had its own issues that eventually led to the dissolution of that project, but we put a full-length album out with that material. And in the meantime, I like Rage Against the Machine a lot, and at the time, and I put together a band that was like Organ Against the Machine. It was those type of riffs, but no guitar. It was all on the Hammond, me beefing the tone up. And I actually did a 5-song EP with that band, but the two guys I was in the band with had to move again, and that really never got put out there. We played some shows. And after all those experiences in those particular projects, that's when I said, I want to just do something with organ, bass, and drums, a power trio. Maybe vocals, maybe not. It doesn't matter. I just want to have some freedom to explore my instrument. And that was kind of the catapult and the birth of when I formed Big Organ Trio.
Great. So, all right. So let's build the bridge between the Void and when you're doing that. So, what happened after the Void? And then that you're working full time, making a go of it. Obviously, doing some sideman work. What was the next thing for you there in that chronology?
Well, that was that was right. That was just prior to Big Organ Trio. I remember. I can't remember. I might have met the bass player. That format was organ, bass, and drums. I wanted to have a power trio, like a Hendrix power trio with that sonic ability. and all the freedom to do what I want on the organ. And I remember I met my bass player at the time, the original bass player, Bernie, and he knew a drummer named Brett, and we kind of just discussed, what do we want to do? You guys interested in making a go at this? And we were all on board. The cool thing about that band is we were all equal partners. Whatever expenses there were, whatever money we made, whatever, we all did it in equal shares. It was a real band where everybody put everything that they had into it. And I think that was the strength of that band in those early days.
Absolutely. Yeah, that it's as you know, it's a rarity to get that sort of equality in a band. So yeah, that's great. So with Big Organ Trio, we're going to come back to all your other stuff, but with Big Organ Trio, how's that evolved over the years? Because from memory, you started that, was that around 2007 or 9? Somewhere around there?
Yeah, it was actually, I think in 2006 was the original lineup. And, we were playing a lot of gigs. I don't know, I guess you could call it in the jam band scene to a degree. We were playing gigs with Melvin Seals, who played with Jerry Garcia, and he would tour around doing the Jerry Garcia band. Carl Denson's Tiny Universe is a great saxophone player. And we ended up getting a record deal with a Japanese record label called P-Vine Records. It was through Velour Records in New York, who I think was started by some guys affiliated with Soul Live, if you're familiar with them. So after that first album, P-Vine picked it up and they re-released it in Japan, and they put a bonus track on it, and then we went on a tour of Japan. I think that was 2007 when we did that. We did a tour with David Pistorius and his band, who's Jocko's nephew. Yeah. So it was like a dual tour. Things were going well, but as things go with bands, without getting into too many specifics, a couple people couldn't get along, and unfortunately, I parted ways with the drummer, Brett, and so me and the bass player continued on, and we got another drummer involved. We did a second album called Unwound, which was released in Japan. And then my bass player had some issues. And long story, I won't get into all the details, but I eventually kind of just separated from the original lineup and started kind of bringing guys in as hired musicians to play with me. Yeah. So I had several different people involved. And it went from Big Organ Trio to Mike Mangan's Big Organ Trio, and it kind of evolved that way. And went from there.
Yeah, and still going strong today, which is great. So let's take a little sidestep, Mike, into some of the other work. So what was very much in organ territory, I've mentioned this to one of our other guests, Bob Fridzema, in that you're a member of that evil cabal or evil secret society of Glenn Hughes organ players alongside Bob Fridzema and Lachy Doley. So there's three of you, and it feels exactly. It feels like collecting baseball cards in that I've managed to get all three of you on the show. So tell us about. I understand in the chronology it's out of whack here, but we'll just go with each artist. So tell us about sort of auditioning for Glenn, and I know Bob said he's had the odd chat with you guys before, but there's been no official meeting of the secret society, I believe.
No, see, I've had, me and Bob met, actually it was interesting, I was on tour with the Cult in Hungary last year, and Glenn had just played there at the same, or they were staying at the same hotel, can't remember if they played the same venue, but they were still there, and I got out of the bus, and, the guys are like family, his manager, Jimi was just walking down the street and saw me get out of the tour bus, he's like, what the hell are you doing here? And, so that's when I first met Bob, which was great talking to Bob. But as far as how I got involved with Glenn, that actually is because of Matt Sorum. the drummer from Guns N' Roses. My band, Big Organ Trio, from playing a lot of shows, we had played with a bass player named Paul Ill, and he happened to be really good friends with Matt Sorum. And Sorum, this is about 10 years ago, he was doing an award show at the Avalon, I think it was, in Hollywood, with his band Kings of Chaos. And he had a whole bunch of different people. He had Billy Gibbons involved, Nuno Betancourt. He had Glenn involved, and they were looking for someone to play Burn, I remember. And they wanted someone who actually played the real Hammond. So Paul knew me, and he told Matt Sorum about me. And that's how I ended up getting that gig. So ended up talking to Matt on the phone, and then went and did that show, went to the rehearsal room. Actually, the first guy in the rehearsal room when I went in there was Billy Gibbons.
Wow.
It was just me and him, and Billy Gibbons was playing my Hammond. They offered me the option of renting me a Hammond or bringing my own, and of course I love my own rig, so I brought my own rig. And then Billy was playing, and I'm like, wow, this is great. And then everybody came in. I think Joe Perry was involved with that also.
Yeah, wow.
He was in that too. But that, when I played Burn, I think Nuno Betancourt was on guitar. McDuff McKagan was on bass, Sorum on drums, Glenn singing, and me playing the Hammond. So that was my first meeting with Glenn. And then, must have been four years later, he was looking for an organist to do a tour in the States. And so he reached out to me again, and that's how that ended up happening.
I mean, there's not many artists that are of a status of Glenn, where essentially he's these brilliant organ players around the world that, you know, he doesn't have to fly them places. He's got them on the continents, which is great. I just think that's amazing.
Exactly. It works out well logistically, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I know you had a bit of experience under your belt at that stage, Mike, but I mean, you've just mentioned, you're in a room with Billy Gibbons, Matt Sorum, Duff McKagan, and obviously Glenn himself. I mean, even at that level, is there still a bit of a pinch me moment there, particularly Billy sitting playing your organ?
Absolutely, man. But, you know, the flip side of it is when, you know, maybe you're not involved with things, you're going through a slow period. I feel like that's weirder than when you're actually doing what you love to do and are supposed to, you know, to be doing. But there's definitely a pinch me moment. I mean, Billy was the nicest guy too. We just chatted for about 10 minutes, and he was playing some blues riffs and everything on the rig. And so he's just a cool dude, but no doubt there was a pinch me moment.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so he obviously knows his way around a Hammond, which I just had no awareness of. So that alone's, interesting. So there you go.
Right.
And so speaking of huge iconic acts, obviously you spent a number of years with, since about 2022. So the last couple of years you played a bunch of gigs with the Cult. Again, tell us how that came about. I obviously understand the Cult originally were UK-based, moved to LA many, many years ago, so I'm assuming there was a connection there.
Yeah, well, again, Matt Sorum, because he was in the Cult before he was in Guns N' Roses.
True, yeah.
And I had a couple, they were looking, their prior, you know, over the years, over their over 4-decade career, I think they've only had 4 keyboard players in that time. You know, they didn't start out with a keyboard player. They kind of came up out of that post-punk era, but they're so versatile, and they constantly evolved in their music that they like to have that element live a lot of the time. So the guy prior to me, Damon Fox, great guy, great musician, he couldn't do the tours. And, you know, this is coming out of the lockdown and all that stuff. So they were looking for someone else to bring in. And I had a few recommendations. My friend John McCloy knew their tour manager, Chuck Randall, at the time. He recommended me to them. And then Matt Sorum, once again, recommended me for the situation. and that's how I got that gig. I remember Billy Duffy calling me up, and we just talked, and it's pretty much ready to go. Interesting thing about the situation musically too is it kind of evolved. Billy's the only guitar player in the band, but he's got a lot of rhythm guitar parts in the albums. And often he likes to have that sonic space filled live. So what we would do, I didn't have a real Hammond with me. I had a SK2. That's actually what I was using. And originally I was using a real Leslie, but it had too many problems. I downgraded to one of those 3300s, the black solid state ones. And then got even smaller with a Leslie 2100. I don't know if you've ever seen those. Looks like a guitar head. Just really the top horn. But a lot of the songs, I would play, overdriven Hammond, but power chords, kind of mimicking the rhythm guitar parts. So that was going on. And certain other songs they have, like Edie, for instance, there's a lot of strings. So I would be playing the string parts. I would do a lot of that. I did all the backup vocals. And then there was also samples that needed to be triggered. So I got this keyboard that I love, an Akai MPC Key 61. Just came out a couple of years ago. I love that thing. It's got its own DAW. You can take samples sent to you, you can dump it in, and you can just tweak them in there and assign them to keys. And you can adjust the velocity so you can get it to feel natural while you're playing it. So that was my 3 keyboard setup in that situation.
So let's you've raised a really fascinating point. So because we have more than 10,000 keyboard players around the world, there's no doubt that some of them, including myself, play cult songs, and particularly those earlier songs where there is no obvious keyboard part. So you've definitely tweaked my interest. Right. To give you, so one example, Mike, I'm playing a gig tonight in a cover band where we are playing She Sells Sanctuary, and you've solved a big mystery. You've solved a big mystery for me, in that I'm doing exactly that. It's about filling that rhythmic space with a good organ patch. So you've just made my day, saying that it sounds like that's the approach you were taking.
Yeah, well, it's something that evolved a little bit because Billy, he always missed, if you listen to the studio recording of She Sells Sanctuary, there's a really hooky rhythm guitar part played on a 12 string.
Yes.
And it goes jing, jing. Of course, you can't pull that off live. And they never really had that element. And over time, I was actually using the Hammond SK Pro for my top keyboard, and not even doing the organ on that. I was using the SK2 for the organ. But I was using that for string patches, and I finally found an acoustic guitar patch on the SK Pro and tweaked it and doubled it and worked with the front of house guy to get it to sound huge. And it actually eventually evolved into me hitting that. And I figured out kind of the right way to phrase the chord to make it sound as close as possible to the 12 string on the album. So I ended up playing that part all the time up on the top keyboard. And then during maybe the verses, I would pad, on a Hammond. Actually ended up putting a little phaser on the Hammond to try to get it to, sort of psychedelic, cool little undertone. So, it's interesting you ask about that, because that was a thing that we were working on to try to make better, Yeah,
no, look, that's amazing. Players around the world, thank you for that, Mike. That's brilliant. And so that I said, that, how many gigs would you have played over those last couple of years with the Cult? Because you did a few tours, I think.
Oh, I did a lot of tours. Spent a lot of time on the road. I couldn't even guess. Could be 100, somewhere in that. We did really cool. We did a arena tour with Alice Cooper in the UK 2 years ago. So I got to meet Alice. That was really cool. But somewhere in that vicinity, I would guess.
Yeah. And what did you learn over that time, Mike? Even though you're so well established in your career, were there any new learnings for you, either from a touring, musical viewpoint, whatever? But what did you learn?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, every situation you're involved in is unique and it's different. When I first got involved, there's samples like Sanctuary, that weird phaser trippy thing at the beginning of the song. They like to have that triggered. So that was my responsibility. And I was using a laptop for a little while until I came across the MPC Key 61 from Akai. And a lot of samples. There's samples in Soul Asylum. We used to play American Horse. I don't know if you're familiar with that one. It's got some wind chimes, some trippy, magical wind chimes. I had all these samples that I had to trigger. I wanted it all consolidated in one keyboard. So, one thing is I got that Akai keyboard, and, it's a little bit of a learning curve, but, I dove into it and was able to learn it enough to utilize it in that situation. And now it's just another tool that I have going forward.
And you found it responsive enough. I'm not sure it's that specific model. I've heard they're amazing units, but sometimes they're not quite agile enough if you're switching between samples really quickly. But it sounds like that wasn't what you were using it for anyway.
Yeah, I used it for a couple different things. They have a nice pad with square pads, and then you can hit one-shot samples. You just tap it and it triggers a sample. But I had other samples I was using on a couple of their newer songs where I actually got some of the rhythm guitar tracks, and I loaded the wave files in from the producer. He sent them to me, and I actually patched them to keys, which you can do on this key, which I love. And then you can adjust the velocity, the volume. You can cut it off, and I would actually take some of the rhythm guitar parts so I could actually play them on the keys itself. I think that's called note on functionality.
Oh, wow.
So I hold it, but as soon as I pull it off, it stops playing. So it's actually like you're playing the part. So it's quite versatile.
So that's much more organic than, say, playing to a click track. And the Colt may use a click track for other things as well, but it sounds like you can more organically play samples than just having them,
Oh, yeah, I wanted to be able to play organically because no, they're not using a click track. They don't like that. So I kind of needed that, ability because, human time will fluctuate a little bit. You want to be able to play with the band. So I just thought that was great, that's one thing in the technical sense that I was able to add to my arsenal and learn how to utilize.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like those earlier days in the jam bands are paid off handsomely, sort of working on the fly a little bit with even larger bands, the ability to adapt and work, with whatever's going on in the song, which is amazing. I know in your biography there's some other great people, and I'm assuming some of these are in context of jam bands or as side projects, but I can't let you get away without asking about, for example, Dr. Lonnie Smith. Now, whether it was a short exposure or whatever it was, he deserves a mention.
God, amazing. My experience with Dr. Lonnie was Big Organ Trio opened up for him numerous times.
There you go.
On some of his tours, he came to a club called the Mint in LA, which has been here since the 30s, I think 37 or 39. I actually backlined my B3 for him, for his show.
Wow.
So we opened up, then I lent him my rig. One thing I remember, like the reverb unit went down right before he was supposed to start playing. And I'm no great organ tech, so I had to call Ken Rich on the phone, and he actually kind of walked us through what we troubleshot the problem with this on the phone, just in the nick of time. But that was some high stress because, I have this legendary guy that I idolize. I'm lending him my equipment, and all of a sudden it doesn't work properly. And that's one great thing about Ken Rich is, I could call him at any point in time. He'd be having dinner with his wife, and he would get on the phone if I had a problem and help me out. So.
And here's a left of center question for you, Mike, because people like Ken, you're right, are so important. What happens in 20 or 30 years when the Ken Riches of the world aren't around? Are there enough younger people learning this stuff to keep these wonderful instruments afloat?
Yeah, it is a specific niche. And there are a couple younger guys that I can go to, and but not many. And there's one, really young guy in his probably early 30s right now that's a capable tech in LA. There's another guy that's established named Bill Axman. He's a good guy, but there's not many,
No, it's certainly a risk for the future, but yeah. Anyway, that's something for also Hammond to keep in mind. So, and with Dr. Lonnie, obviously, you said you supported him. What have your interactions been like? I mean, he is an icon. Anything you've learnt from him, just even in having a chat?
He's such a humble guy. I do remember him saying once, he's like, I've done all right. I've done a pretty good job trying to carry on the legacy. I mean, he's coming from the era where you had your Jimmy Smiths and your Jack McDuffs and your Groove Holmes, and so he was such an amazing player and a unique player and a soulful player and a master, but he was humble too, and he was from what my interactions with him, he was appreciative of what he was able to do in life, and the ability and the opportunity to be a musician and play such an incredible instrument,
Yeah, absolutely. No. And speaking of iconic people creating and building on legacies, Robby Krieger, how did that involvement come about?
Actually opened up again with Big Organ Trio he had a band called Tribal Jazz years ago, and I remember having a conversation with him, and I did ask him about Morrison. I had to ask him about Jim Morrison. I think the only thing he said is, he goes, "I've never met anyone like that guy before or since."
Yeah.
That was his response. But we actually played a song called Freedom Jazz Dance in our set, and he was familiar with that song. I think that was written by Eddie Harris.
Okay.
And so we had a discussion about that too, because he's a big fan of jazz.
Yeah.
And so we had a good discussion about that.
There you go. And right up there in the pantheon with Robby is Bernie Worrell. So, again, there's another amazing artist.
Yeah, there's another guy, again, Big Organ Trio. I played with him in his solo band. And I got to borrow him, my Hammond too, for that gig, I remember. I think we might have done a couple gigs with him.
Wow.
And he was super cool too, man. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of mojo in this thing now at this point.
I was about to say, that thing's worth a fortune, Mike.
Yeah. There's more. There's more that have played this too.
I mean, have you seen the 4K redo of the Talking Heads? God, I'm having a mental blank on the name of the amazing redo recently they've released. Have you checked that out?
I have not yet. No.
No, it's amazing. Obviously, you see him in all his glory, Bernie there. So, no, that's amazing.
Awesome,
Now, Mike, I haven't mentioned a swathe of artists you've worked with, but I'm actually interested in you picking out one. Is there a further artist you've worked with that has been a highlight for you, either from a collaborative viewpoint or learning from them or teaching someone something, or, just fascinated what your pick is?
Well, if you want to talk about, iconic, legendary musicians, Keith Emerson, of course.
Yes, and I did want to ask you about it. Please, go ahead.
Yeah, I became friends with Keith. That was fascinating. That was back in the early days of Big Organ Trio. All the crazy stuff he used to do on stage, and tossing the Hammond around and stabbing him with knives. And in particular, he would go around to the backside and play it in reverse. And I just thought that was so cool from an entertainment standpoint, and also from a, musically challenging point. Could you rewire your brain to play something meaningful? So I started doing that in Big Organ Trio, actually. during one of our songs. Kind of came up with this thing and kind of became a thing during our concerts. And we got some video of it once, and it was put up on YouTube kind of in the early days. And Keith's wife, Mari, she saw it and showed it to Keith. I guess this is, me finding this out afterwards. And we had a residency at a small club down in Santa Monica. And one night he just showed up to our gig. And my bass player was like, Keith Emerson's in the crowd, man. I'm like, what? Oh, God, you gotta be kidding me. That was nerve-wracking.
To say the least.
And he actually ended up coming up and playing with us.
Wow.
We invited him up, and then he came back a couple times after that. I mean, that just goes to show it was a small place, and he just loved to play. He's a real Hammond organ, and what an honor, what an incredible experience. And I became friends with him, and we had a lot of discussions about various things. And he's actually part of my onstage debacle.
Oh, please. Well, that's probably a good segue.
Situation. So we can talk about that later. And he's part of one of my favorite albums, too. I had an interesting experience with him that was kind of synchronicitous, you could say. I guess I'll divulge one of my albums that I love. It's called Live, Live, exclamation point, by Jack McDuff. It's a live album, Jack McDuff from 1963. And there's this track on there. It's the first track called Rock Candy. And I don't know, man, I just love that track. And I'm one of those guys that if I love a song, I will obsessively listen to it over and over and over and over and over again. And something about that particular track was the tone that he was getting out of the B3 he was playing was this really grinding, crunchy tone that was kind of uncharacteristic of that era. There weren't really any guys tweaking the tone in that regard. So that's one of the reasons I love that track so much. So when I finally met Keith, I remember after the first time he came out to see us, we sat down and were chatting, and that album came up. And he said to me, yeah, there's a track in there called Rock Candy. And he's like, that organ tone is what inspired me to start messing with the tone of the Hammond in the early days. And that kind of blew my mind because we're both on the same wavelength, and I'd been listening to the same song for years, thinking the same thing. So I found that to be fascinating.
Amazing. And it's probably impossible to encapsulate what you learned from Keith Emerson. Like, it's just any time you're spending time with someone like that, you're learning something. But were there any real approach to life, or just even playing, or anything that you took from that friendship with him?
Yeah, again, humility. He was so nice and, kind and, forthcoming, and told me numerous stories about, his touring and so forth. And just you could tell the appreciation he had for what he was able to do in life. And, I think that's just a lesson for everybody, a human lesson, to try to appreciate, the blessings that you have,
Absolutely. And that's probably a good juncture at which to ask you, Mike, do you're well enough established in your career now that if you met someone that was just coming into the industry and wanting to make a career doing something similar to what you've done, what advice would you give to someone starting out? Humility is obviously one part of it, but anything else?
Right. Well, I guess in a basic sense, just persevere, keep going, and do what you love from your heart. Follow what your passion is, and be true to yourself. Keep going and be proactive. One thing I can say, though, is we are living in a continuously, exponentially changing world. From vinyl to CDs to MP3s to, Spotify, to the explosion of the internet to even AI music now. So I don't know if you've seen some of this AI-generated music. So it's a totally different ball game in its world these days. And I guess, something else I could say is just, I guess, try to familiarize oneself with the environment that you're dealing in these days, social media, Spotify, and so forth, just so you have a grasp on how things are working. I guess another thing I can say too is if someone does call you for a gig and so forth, try to be professional, get back to them on time, and things like that. I think interpersonal relationships are big.
You've just prompted me to ask a question I hadn't planned on asking. You mentioned Spotify, and obviously there's lots of, I would argue, legitimate criticism of Spotify. But as someone that has released a range of original work as well, what's your take on Spotify? Do you tend to use it as a promotional mechanism, avoid it like the plague? What's your take on it? Because it is a highly problematic model from a financial viewpoint.
Yeah, I mean, you get a teeny weeny percentage as a musician, and I think we're all aware of the problem with that. I mean, I use it. I have my music up there, but I wish something could be done about that. I don't really have any proactive suggestions about what to do about it. I mean, it's been a pretty public problem, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the whole model is a train wreck, which is my feeble attempt to segue to a train wreck, Mike. So tell us about an amazing time something's gone wrong for you on stage.
Oh, okay, train wreck. Well, I'll never forget this. So Keith Emerson, I actually had a gig at the Mint with Big Organ Trio, and Keith showed up, and the Mint's a small club, but it's an iconic club. Keith sat right down in front of me, so he's like 2 feet away from me for the whole set, right? I did the backwards thing, right, during the set. And, part of the deal is like there's a point when I'm doing it where I come back around to the front and continue playing the song from the front. However, this time on the Mint stage, there's rafters. There's like a rafter right there behind you because I was on stage right. For some reason, this time I came around and I tripped and I smashed my head on the rafter and I completely fell off the stage. So right in front of him, which was great. One cool thing is when I got back up on the stage, the whole crowd erupted in cheers. So I thought that was great. But one thing afterwards, I came down and I talked to Keith, and just another testament to how cool the guy was. He told me, he's like, God, if I could tell you all the times I've broken bones, I've fallen over on this, doing all the crazy stuff he did. And then he ended up telling me about, I don't know if you ever seen footage of the tour they did where they had Keith in a big cage and a grand piano inside the cage. And it flew over the audience with him playing a full grand piano inside a cage, spinning around upside down doing flips. And remember he told me about that in this conversation. And he actually broke a rib doing that. And then he told me that they only did it for one tour and the insurance was way too expensive. The whole thing was too expensive. And that was the end of that. But
that's amazing.
He had a lot of stories about his mishaps to help me feel better and not so embarrassed about falling off the stage.
Yes, still, but a head injury is still nothing to sneeze at as far as a good on stage train wreck. So well done, right. Yeah, good job. And then there is also Mike, the dreaded Desert Island Disc question. So 5 albums that if you could only choose 5, what would they be?
This kind of goes into some of my influences, but I guess not necessarily in this particular order. But first one is called Black and Blue by the Gene Harris Quartet. Gene Harris is a jazz piano player and is my favorite jazz piano player, one of my favorite musicians of all time. He's kind of known as the blues master of the jazz idiom. And, part of my reason for playing music, it's kind of a spiritual experience for me. It is a spiritual experience. I learned this word, frisson. It's when you get goosebumps listening to music. And there's some players that do that to me for some reason. And Gene's one of those guys. And he's just an amazing player to me. And so I chose this album, Black and Blue. It's one of his later studio albums. That would be one of my top picks. And then the aforementioned Live by Jack McDuff. It's a live album by the jazz organist Jack McDuff. Then I chose Brothers and Sisters by the Allman Brothers. And largely because it's got another one of my favorite keyboard players, Chuck Leavell.
Yeah.
And that was his, introduction to the band. I mean, one thing I got to mention is Allman had passed by that point, so he wasn't on that album. So as a side album with that would be Live at the Fillmore East, Allman Brothers live album. The particular thing about Brothers and Sisters is Chuck's performances, especially in Southbound and Jessica, just huge inspirations to me. And then I guess I got two more. I'm gonna have to say huge influences on me. Stevie Ray Vaughan, In Step. It has songs like Crossfire, Tightrope, which the outro guitar solo on Tightrope has one of the nastiest note bends in history. If you ever just go back and listen to that, it's like a 1.5 note bend. It just sounds like he's wringing the life out of the instrument, man. It's got Riviera Paradise, absolute beautiful song with Reese Winans, another one of my favorite keyboard players. He's on there. And if I could add his version of Voodoo Child on that album, I'd tack that on. And then I guess my last one would be Are You Experienced by Hendrix. And both Hendrix and Stevie Ray for me, because I like to mess around with the tone on the Hammond so much. Often I'm trying to achieve some of the sonic craziness that those guys achieved on the guitar. So they're huge influences on me in that way. But I take Are You Experienced, that has Manic Depression on it, and Fire and Third Stone from the Sun. So I guess those would be my 5.
Great picks. And just for the sake of our watchers and listeners, I know I've mentioned this before, but those 5 will be added to our Apple Music and Spotify, sadly, playlist. And every single guest has chosen 5 albums, and there's now over 5,000 songs sitting there. If you want an eclectic playlist, it's well worth checking out. I obviously don't make any money out of that. It's just purely for the audience, but it's an amazing playlist to listen to because I can tell you now, Mike, 4 of those 5 albums have never been picked before across 120 guests. So
really, that's very cool.
Yeah.
Which one has? Probably Hendrix.
Hendrix.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I do have 2 runner-ups just for the heck of it.
Yeah.
Which is December by George Winston. If you ever heard of George Winston, he was kind of a neoclassical type of player. It's a huge influence on me as his version of Paco Belcannon on that album. And he plays it in C. That thing blew my mind for some reason when I first heard it years ago. I actually sat down and learned the whole thing note for note by ear. It took me quite a while, but that was a big influence on me. And then another one is a classical pianist named Murray Perahia. His recording of Chopin's 24 Etudes.
Wow.
Quite mind-blowing.
There you go.
Absolutely
I'll be checking
crazy.
that one out as well. No, thank you. Good 2 runners up.
I forgot to add this in. I just would feel bad if I didn't. You asked about keyboard techs in L.A. Well, your fellow countryman, Luke Jones, out here.
Oh, okay.
Is a great keyboard tech, and I've known him for many, many years.
Well done, Luke. I'll be checking out Luke as well. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, he has a shop called Custom Vintage Keys, and he can refinish Hammonds and vintage keyboards. Does an amazing job.
There you go. It's such a skill.
And he can fix them, and so I wanted to give a shout out to Luke.
Appreciate that a lot.
Absolutely.
Now, our final question, Mike, is what we call our quick fire 10. So it's 10 short and sharp sub questions to learn a little bit more about you. So first one is first album you ever heard.
Oh, that's a very interesting question. See, I'm the youngest of 6 kids. My parents are way older, so they listen to a lot of jazz. Then I have all the rock influences from my brothers and sisters. But I remember my brother buying me the Dire Straits album.
Brothers in Arms?
Which had Sultans of Swing on it.
Oh, yeah, the original. Yeah, okay, the self-titled
Yeah,
album. Yeah.
That's one of my earliest memories of albums. And I do remember the Doors' first album being in there in the mix, too.
Great. No, that's excellent. Your most important pre-gig ritual, whether with the big organ trio or any other one, what do you need to do before a gig to feel settled before you go on stage?
You know, I kind of like to have some time by myself, actually. Sometimes touring, especially, you know, with bands like The Cult and stuff like that, there's people milling about backstage. But I know some of my bandmates, love all those guys, they also like to just get some decompression time by themselves. Or if it's, you know, with your bandmates, too. To be with your bandmates a little bit, you know, 10, 15 minutes of just you guys before you go out on stage.
Great.
You know, me as a keyboard player, unfortunately, I don't have an instrument to warm up with before I go out there. You know, like the bass players, guitar players are always sitting in the dressing room kind of warming up. I don't really have a little side keyboard to do that on usually.
I'd love to see you make the argument to management that you need a backstage warm-up B3. I'd love to see the reaction.
A vintage one.
Yeah, vintage one. Yeah, that's right.
That's the vintage.
If you hadn't been a musician, Mike, what do you think your career choice would have been?
Boy, that's interesting. Maybe a philosopher of science.
Wow, that's cool.
I'm very interested in philosophy and the big questions of life and how it intersects with our understanding of science and so forth. Although I kind of like physical labor too. So maybe I would have done some construction. I even had thought about, you know, being an EMT, something like that.
Oh, yeah, wow. Yeah.
You know, such a profoundly important job, you know, helping other people. So those kind of arenas, perhaps.
Great. No, that's excellent. Transpose button or adjust on the fly? I think I know the answer, but we ask it anyway.
Oh, transpose. It just depends on the situation. Transpose button. Because sometimes bands like to play things a half step down. And I finally figured out how to transpose a real Hammond.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. I don't know if you want. You could add this in, but we were playing Burn a half step down when I first met Glenn.
Oh, yeah.
Storm actually asked me, you know, do you want to do it in G, which is the regular key, or like F or F sharp? And I'm like, you know, I've been learning it in G, and that, you know, that solo especially to try to play that a half step down would be complete inversion. So we agreed to do it in G, and we got to rehearsal, and Glenn was like, so hey, can we do this in F sharp? And I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. And Storm's like, well, he can't because he can't drop tune the Hammond. Glenn's like, all right, I like a good challenge. And he sang it in G and crushed it.
Wow.
All the high parts, everything. Just incredible, actually. But because of that experience, I ended up, when I toured with Glenn in the States the first couple of years, they actually were backlining me real Hammonds. It's hard to get them in Europe when I went over there with him, and I figured out with a Digitech drop pedal, actually, to how to drop a Hammond, and it worked amazingly well. So
you're essentially running the output into the pedal and then dropping it there and then out to front of house.
Correct.
Yep.
And, you know, I didn't know at first if it would sound weird, but it sounds great, you know. So
that's cool.
It can be done. So
I thought you were going to say like you were mucking around with voltages and like.
No, I know, because it'll sync and pitch with the volt. That's too confusing, and you get into half pitches and all that stuff.
No, that'd be incredible.
The drop pedal works great, man.
No, excellent. Favorite gig you've ever done, if that's at all possible?
I guess there's big organ trio in Japan, played the Billboard Live. You know,
yeah, see, that's great.
Quite amazing. But I did do Harley Fest with the Cult last year in my hometown. And that was awesome too. It was the 120th anniversary of Harley. It's like probably 50, 60,000 people. And we were playing with Green Day. And that was a really great gig to be in my hometown also.
Yeah. And we'll be linking to video of that, Mike. I know there's some great video of that show, so we'll make sure we link to that.
And it's interesting too, the versatility of the Cult. It was really cool. They have a song called The Witch. I don't know if you ever heard that. It was a single they did. I think it was in a movie. I might remember the movie. And there's a blues jam outro on the studio album that they do. Another nod to the versatility of the Cult. They're not afraid to go into different areas. And they had never played that outro live. But when I got in the band and they decided to play The Witch, they're like, let's do it finally. So I thought it was really an honor, really cool, there's a big B3 solo on the outro and, guitar solo, B3 solo at the end. So,
no, amazing. And so it might link my favourite city you've ever played. Would that be Tokyo or somewhere else?
I think I could say Tokyo. It's just because the fans are so intense and so, full of energy. It's quite astounding.
They are, yeah. And it doesn't matter which band or gig. Favourite song you've played at a gig in the last year that you just really enjoy playing?
Favorite song that I've played? Oh, okay. Actually, so I was doing some gigs with Gilby Clarke in his band. Great guitar player, great guy. And it was a band called the Keith Richards. I actually played a little harmonica in the band too. And it was mostly cover songs, some of his original material. But mostly cover songs that we all liked. And I Want You by the Beatles. Really good song to play.
Great.
And then we actually played The Letter by Joe Cocker too.
Oh, yeah.
And,
that's a fun song. Yeah.
So.
No, excellent. And favourite music documentary or movie that you keep going back to?
Oh, man. I do have the whole Beatles anthology.
Yeah.
I do have that. This sticks in my mind for some reason, Listomania by The Who.
Ah, okay, yep.
So, Liszt, just a side note, considered the greatest technical pianist in history, although we have no recordings of him, but he was friends with Chopin. In fact, Chopin wrote his etudes for Liszt. Liszt was the first guy to play him in public. But The Who made this movie called Listomania. I mean, before Beatlemania, there was Listomania. And that's just a crazy movie, and it's kind of based off that history. And it was really cool. I was on tour with the Cult. We were in Hungary, and that's where Franz Liszt is from. And I got to go down into the market square, and there's this giant statue of Liszt they got down there, and that was really fun for me also. But I'll say Listomania.
Yeah, great. Great pick, an original pick. Name one thing you'd like to see invented as a keyboard player that would make your life easier.
I guess I can speak as a vintage Hammond organ player, and I do it my own way right now, but I've always wanted to have a processing contraption to be able to bend notes on the Hammond. Kind of like a whammy bar or even a pitch bending wheel. I've actually been talking to a couple engineers about something like this. I do it in a different way right now, but something where I had that amount of control would just be awesome. I've been thinking about that for a long time. I know that's a real niche thing.
Nothing wrong with that. I mean, we've got a whammy clav. We might as well have a whammy Hammond.
Oh, yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah, why not?
Absolutely.
And then last but not least, your favourite non-musical activity or hobby, Mike. What keeps you sane outside of music?
I like to jump rope for exercise.
Wow.
I do it on the road. I do it in hotel rooms. And I also like riding bicycles for activities. So I'll do that.
Jumping rope, that's amazing. Look, Mike, I can't thank you enough for spending time with us. I never thought, aside from your amazing career and your amazing insights, that we would talk about jumping rope, the chicken dance, head injuries. We've covered the game. So I cannot thank you enough. We look forward to keeping in touch, and hopefully we see you down in Australia again in the future.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'll throw this in. You asked me about a current artist.
Oh, yes.
Rachel Flowers.
Well, I've had the pleasure, and I wouldn't expect you would have seen it, but we ended up doing 2 whole parts with Rachel. She's amazing.
She came to a Big Organ Trio gig years ago, just showed up.
Yeah.
And came up to me afterwards, and her mom, who I love, Jimi, right?
Yes.
Introduced me, and Rachel's like, "Can I play your organ? More mojo in here." You know,
yes,
Keith
absolutely.
And Rachel goes up there and rips off Tarkus perfectly. For like 3 straight minutes. I'm just like, what is going on here?
She's a force of nature.
Profoundly moving.
It is. You know? She's utterly amazing. And there we have it. I hope you enjoyed that interview with Mike. I certainly enjoyed speaking with him, getting some of his amazing insights into what's been a great career to date, and obviously lots more to come from Mike. So, again, thank you for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. I do want to give a shout out to our gold and silver supporters. I want to start out with a brand new silver supporter, Mr. Dewey Evans. Dewey, it's great to have you on as a supporter. Dewey's been a supporter for a while now, and as you'll hear in the future, we're going to have him on the show in one of our live streams. He's got an interesting career as a writer, including in relation to keyboards. So we'll be talking more about that in the future. So huge thank you. And then also to Midnight Mastering, if you require any good mixing and or mastering of tracks that you're creating yourself, please do give Midnight Mastering a consideration. I use them myself and highly recommend them. Also, a big shout out to Dave Bryce and the team at the musicplayer.com forums and the Keyboard Corner in particular. I love hanging out there, and that's why I've spent more than 20 years hanging out there, and will continue to do so. So if you like talking with like-minded individuals, that's definitely a place to check out. And last but definitely not least, Tammy Catcher from Tammy's Musical Stew. Tammy's been an ongoing and long-term supporter. Thank you so much, Tammy, as always. So again, thank you for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. And if you want to keep in touch, do drop us a line at editor@keyboardchronicles.com. And we're on all the socials under the Keyboard Chronicles as well. And otherwise, keep on playing.